Good afternoon and welcome to our 9th Ideas Lab. After one virtual year, the 8th edition, which was May last year, and the 7th, which was just one day, I think, almost before the lockdown, here in Belgium at least. We're happy to welcome you so many. So I'm surprised to see so many people live here. I think you're as happy as I am to see so many people again and that we can catch up again. With this, I want to introduce our chair, who's here today as well in person, and he will then introduce the next session briefly, which will start on time. So Joaquin Almunia is here. You know Joaquin, former commissioner, former minister in Spain, but also today chairman of the board of CEPS.
Good afternoon to everybody. Thank you very much, Karel, for your introduction, and thank you very much, of course, to all of you for attending this new edition of Ideas Lab. I well remember the last in-person Ideas Lab in 2020, when we were running, those who were not living in Brussels, running to the airport just in case our country would be locked down the day after. Hopefully, you are now in a safer personal situation than 2 years ago. I'm very happy to come back to the presential Ideas Lab. I'm very happy to be here, to have the possibility to listen to all those panelists and speakers that will discuss the real challenges that we are having in this period, a period that is different than the one we were living in 2 years ago. We still have among us the pandemic, but in a softer way. We have climate change, as we had 2 years ago, but with more clear signals that this is a reality not for the future, not only for the future, but also for today, for millions and millions of citizens and territories. We have war, unfortunately, and this is the main challenge we have as Europeans, as democrats, as citizens, to help Ukrainians to fight against the invaders and to support their efforts, to support their lives, to support their economy, and to open the doors for a European perspective for this country that is giving us a signal of courage, a signal of how the Ukrainian people share our values, freedoms, democracy, respect of human rights against the autocrat that had decided to end with this experience, fantastic experience of the Ukrainian society, of the Ukrainian people. At stake, we have the very reasons that founded Europe, the European Union: peace, prosperity, solidarity, security, and we need to be able to make the consequences of the respect of those values a reality for millions of people within the EU and outside the EU across the world. We have a lot of challenges to be discussed, to be thought, and CEPS is there to fulfill our responsibilities with our characteristics that you know very well: independence, excellence in the research we are carrying out and in the outcomes of this research, the professionality of the team of CEPS, and our ability as a think tank to open our doors to all of the people, such as you, that are interested in sharing with us your considerations, your ideas, your alternatives, and your proposals. We need to think not only on peace, security, prosperity, we need to think a lot on sustainability, how to make our world more sustainable. We need to think, of course, in the social cohesion of our societies that is under threat because of the impact of the changes that are at the origin of the increase in inequalities in our society, on the weaker feelings of solidarity in parts of our societies. And nowadays, we have to add a new challenge that many of us thought that was part of the past, that is inflation and its consequences, economic consequences and social consequences. We need to put ahead the value of European integration. What can be our capacity to respond and to react to all these challenges and threats without an integrated Europe? And in the last couple of years, vis-à-vis the pandemic crisis, and nowadays with the Ukrainian war and the energy crisis associated with this war, we need to put in our minds the need to share more sovereignty. This is what European integration is about, the process of sharing sovereignty by free member states that wants to deliver better results and better protection for our citizens thanks to our common efforts. We need to develop the idea of the strategic autonomy that was 2 decades ago thought only for defense purposes, but nowadays strategic autonomy of Europe spread over many other areas that we are now trying to put into the agenda of political decisions of European policies. We need to ask our leaders, our political leaders, at the national and at the European level, to strengthen the political will to further develop European integration and to be able to offer to all of us a common vision of our future, not only for us, but in particular for the next generations. We have now in Europe a very important project, Next Generation EU, but the challenges for the next generations in Europe are not only linked with the funds that have been put forward in the last couple of years. The next generations needs to live in a more peaceful environment, in a more healthy environment regarding climate, but also regarding public health. They need to live in a safer and stronger democratic institutions and framework that sometimes is put at risk, even within our borders. And we need to ask the leaders to convince all the citizens in Europe that we need to make efforts to be successful in responding to the present challenges. It's not only about, as Kennedy said many years ago, it's not only what we can ask the political leaders, it's also what we can make to help with our efforts, with our cohesion, with our solidarity fields, with our cooperation, the achievement of the big goals, of the big objectives that are being defined at the EU level and among the democracies across the world. CEPS is there to help in this task. It's not easy. The changes are very deep and are developing very rapidly in our world nowadays. A lot of uncertainties require a response, and we as a think tank, we need to cooperate in providing this food for thought. And sometimes, if we are successful, we can provide even the solutions to the uncertainties and to the questions. We have an excellent team of researchers, an excellent organization that needs to prove every day our excellence, going to win tenders and to develop projects of research, and to ensuring the outreach of our outcomes, not only for political authorities, but also for the civil society, for the social leaders, and for all the citizens in Europe. Citizens need to be convinced by politicians, but also to receive good arguments, strong arguments for all those, such as CEPS and other think tanks, to clarify the situation, to offer the possible alternatives, viable alternatives, to find solutions and to move forward. This is our task during these days, these years, but in particular it's our task today with all the debates and the discussions that you will have in this afternoon. Thank you very much again for attending this new edition of Ideas Lab, and I hope all of you will be this evening, after our discussions, after our debates, convinced that the fantastic ambitions and the goals put forward by our leaders, by our institutions, can be developed and can be achieved with viable, positive, and possible solutions. Thank you very much for your presence, for your participation, and let's hope that you will be happy this evening once Ideas Lab will come to an end. Thank you. And now the first debate will be chaired by Daniel Gros, member of our board, and very well known at CEPS and in many other places of the world since many years. Daniel, thank you.
I was wondering whether there was a mic hidden somewhere here, but apparently not. So, in principle, we have 5 participants today. And yes, I'm sorry, I should be moving here. In particular, we are honored to have the Deputy Prime Minister of Ukraine, Olha Stefanishina, with us today. And we are very grateful. We're very grateful for your presence, and we know that you have to leave us early because your government needs to be functioning, and you are part of it. With me here on the podium, we have Tara Varma from the ECFR, Stephanie Hoffmann from the Bertelsmann Stiftung, and René Repasi, well known this town, now member of the European Parliament. The game plan I have in mind is, if you allow me, Prime Minister, to start with 5 minutes each for our 2 researchers to tell us what they think Europeans think. So what are Europeans expecting from the EU, and of course, in particular in this situation, what are Europeans willing and able to do to help Ukraine, help restore peace to our continent? And then, Olha, if you permit, then I would like to have you to react to them and whatever message you have to us. So without further ado, I would give the floor immediately to Isabell Hoffmann from the Bertelsmann Stiftung, which has an ongoing program to measure EU opinions, it's called. It has a special website where you can find all the results. But first, Isabell, can you please give us, let's say, the 3 main messages you have from your most recent wave?
Yes, thank you very much, Danielle. Thank you very much for inviting me and for this wonderful occasion to be here and to speak to all of you about this very important issue of public opinion in times of Zeitenwende. I mean to be very short and make 3 initial points. The first one is, obviously, the war in Ukraine, the shock of war, the human suffering and the horrible pictures coming out of this country have left a deep mark on European public opinion. That means that generally speaking, Europeans do back political measures in support of Ukraine. That is a very strong effect that we see in the numbers. However, and this is also important to note, they're also very, very much about their personal situation, as they see their personal prospects dampening. These attitudes and expectations of personal lives we do measure also on a regular basis. And as we witness a rapid and significant shift in general attitudes, in a wish to stand in solidarity with Ukraine, we should also keep in mind that these issues of peace and war reach very deep into the political culture, meaning that we also should expect in the future political debates about what Zeitenwende actually means, support and solidarity, and that we see these debates pop up at different moments and different occasions in different member states. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That is difficult to beat in terms of conciseness. And Tara, I invite you to emulate her.
I'll try and do my best. Many thanks for the invitation. So we had published a poll at ECFR on European perceptions of French diplomatic leadership in the run-up to the French presidential election that took place a month ago now. But of course, basically our survey happened a few days before the beginning of the war in Ukraine. And there were a few questions that we asked that I think were relevant for the situation today. What we saw was that Europeans said that they were completely disillusioned with the international system. 71% of respondents that we surveyed in 12 member states said that they didn't believe the international system was working. And 58% believed that their national system wasn't working either to tackle the major issues that we have right now. What they did say was that actually they thought the European level and the European Union were the appropriate level to tackle those issues. And I thought that was really interesting. Amongst the main priorities and the main issues that European citizens want the EU to tackle is security at their borders. And I think that is quite relevant to what we're looking at today. We had advocated in our paper for the French president to present a strong European foreign policy agenda to protect Europeans against those threats that we detail a bit in the paper. And we also asked him to engage the EU geopolitically with Russian and Chinese efforts to reshape the international order, to present also a different European vision for that. And I think that is clearly even more appropriate today. By doing so, we had argued the French president would cement the Europeans' conviction that the EU can face these challenges today. What we've been looking at, and I think Joaquin Almunia referred to this already as strategic autonomy, we called it strategic sovereignty in our paper, the need for the EU to basically deal with the interlinked challenges of economic and security challenges, because we can't separate the two anymore. What we are looking at as Europeans is dealing with security in a very broad sense, climate, digital, security and defense in the traditional sense of the word, but of course energy and food prices today. And we need to have institutions that can answer all of those challenges. And what we've seen are European citizens basically since COVID who are more ambitious than their leaders and the leaders of the European Union. The European citizen seems to be more convinced that the EU can tackle those challenges, and I think what is left up now is for the EU leaders to show that European citizens are ready to be so trustful in their union.
Thank you very much. I think we have actually very consistent messages from two very different organizations. But I think everybody agrees that this could become Europeans' hour, to misuse a famous word from the 1990s. But let us see whether this will actually materialize. As promised, I would like now to give the floor to Olga Stefanishina. She's the Deputy Prime Minister, and that's an interesting title, for European and Euro-Atlantic integration of Ukraine. I think that's a program already in itself. For those who are sitting here in the audience, just to say that Olga has not been able to put on her video, therefore we will only hear her. And on the screen we see somebody whom I have forgotten to salute so far, Eva Maydell, who is a member of the European Parliament. And I propose, Eva, that you will come in after we have heard from the Ukrainian Deputy Prime Minister. Many thanks for your patience, and now I hope we can actually also see the Deputy Prime Minister of Ukraine. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, colleagues. I hope you hear me well. I'm sorry for addressing you from such an awkward location while now I'm in a tour via different EU capitals to discuss the expectations on the June meeting of European Council, and now I'm on my way to Bratislava to have some meetings ahead of LOPSEC conference and to discuss in more details our expectations. I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to address in front of such a distinguished audience. I will not go into many details, as I'm sure you all know very well the backdrop of the application for membership Ukraine made and the expectations from our side. But now having a very precise and detailed discussions with many of the leaders in EU capitals, held at the level of my president, both in Kiev, but also in different types of conversations, I can confirm that most of the European leaders now consider that the decision of granting Ukraine the candidate status in June is the major decision, a historical one. And this is the biggest decision which could be taken. But from our, I would say, more strategic perspective, I think that this is the first stone which will set the basis for a broader strengthening of European Union and basically putting the way towards a stronger Europe. As everybody now understands, Ukraine is fighting against one of the biggest armies of the world and one of the biggest tyrannies in the world so far, which has been subjected to the biggest sanctions ever imposed in history on one country, and which has committed already all possible and known to the humanity war crimes we all only heard about since the end of the Second World War. And now when we're thinking about the decision which is expected to be taken by the end of June, it is also part of the answer not only for Ukraine when it comes to the reforms agenda, building the European future of Ukraine, or also rebuilding Ukraine based on European standards. It's also part of the answer what comes after the change of the regime in Russian Federation. This is something we should think of, because Russians are thinking what happens after Putin is out of his throne. And basically the idea they are working on is to make sure that when the head of one dragon is out there, another head of the other dragon is there. But when this transformation is happening, this would be a window of opportunity to transform the Russia itself. And I don't want us to be also in a situation when we will be thinking what should be the way forward for Ukraine after this transformation in Russia is taking place. So granting Ukraine a candidate status and taking this legal step by mobilizing the political leadership of EU leaders would be also part of this answer. So when the transformation moment in Russia is taking place, it would be clear that Ukrainian agenda is very crystal clear and that we are part of the European Union, and thus the reforms agenda and the agenda in Russia will be also very much clear in that regard. So we wouldn't have to give the answer to those questions. We can give the answers right now. For us, it's also very important that while at this moment we have the feeling, and it is also shown by Eurobarometer, that most of the citizens around EU capitals support Ukrainian membership towards European Union. They feel that Ukraine belongs to this family, as well as it is very clear that most of the parliaments representing these nations also support European integration and European track from our country. For us, it's very important that we insist on having this decision by the end of the June, not only because it is like a natural process, but also because Ukraine has been fitted by so many political promises while politicians were coming and leaving. And from Budapest to Bucharest, and Budapest when we have signed the memorandum to withdraw from ourselves as a nuclear country, to Bucharest, where we were promised to become the member of NATO, the promise which has never been implemented. These promises has weakened us to some extent and has made us hostages of these promises. So we do not want European leaders at this stage to repeat these unfortunate lessons of the past, and by delivering a promise over the summit in Versailles in March, and the next legal step of granting Ukraine a candidate status would set in stone this promise and would set in stone the further step towards that. For us, it's also really important, as you can see that now in Ukraine, the population, the civil society, the expert community, and the government fully support European integration in Ukraine. More than 91% of Ukrainian citizens has been advocating for the application toward membership, which has been signed by President, Parliament, and the government of Ukraine. This decision is also very important for us to set in stone the understanding among the leaders of European Union that no matter how long this war is lasting, no matter how exhausting this war will be, we all are committed to build a stronger and united Europe based on principles. This decision is essential. Otherwise, if we will squeeze ourselves in discussions related to the ending of the war, the territorial integrity of Ukraine, this would serve the legitimization of the crimes which are now taking place in our territory. But commitment to rebuild and restore Ukraine together, to build Ukraine as part of the EU family, is a very strong argument towards further engagement and path towards the future of Europe and the future of Ukraine in Europe. It's very important now to, let's say, address some of the concerns of those countries and the leaders who are skeptical. We understand that there's no fast track of joining the European Union, and we are not going to push or ask for any kind of this solution. For us, it's really important to get the legal commitment and to go throughout all of the way, starting from the broader engagement into discussions of the general format of the enlargement policy, European political community, or any other formats of, for example, strengthening security and defense policy. So for us, taking this step is essential at this particular historical moment, and then we are ready to engage into further discussions, further formats, and of course, for us at this stage, the ultimate issue is to end the war, to restore and regain our territories in its full entirety, and start the Marshall Plan implementation for my country. Hopefully through the financing from the Russian Federation, but also with the support of the European institution and the patronage of different European capitals over Ukrainian capitals, over Ukrainian cities around Ukraine. I think that these decisions and this historical window of opportunities is particularly important to make sure that the leaders hear the voices of their nations, feel the sense of the historical moment, and avoid the ambiguity and mistakes which has been made over the past decades For us, it's really important that while Ukraine is holding the peaceful sky over the European EU capitals by its resistance, by its fighting, by its commitment to European values, it's very important that the political leaders are not stepping back and we do not hear the narrative of unwillingness to irritate Russia. This war, which has started in its full entirety on 24th of February, has shown that the beer is not that big and is not that severe, that by our unity, our strength and dedication, by strong signals and decisions, we show that democracy can prevail, that the values can prevail, and that the humanity can prevail. So we hope that with your support, with my address to you, you will take some measures to message the leaders of EU nations that this is the time for strong decisions. This is the time not for the leaders of opinions, but for the leaders of actions. And I hope that this discussion today with such a distinguished and knowledgeable audience will allow us to boost this discourse and to make sure that all the leaders hear our messages and act as brave, as strong as the time requires this moment. Thank you so much.
Many thanks. I think you could hear the approval from the audience here. And I just wanted to add that earlier this morning we had a special session on the economy of Ukraine with your Minister of Finance and other representatives of your economic ministry. And the message they gave was one of an extraordinary resilience also of the Ukrainian economy itself, and the way the government is actually using this time to pursue further economic reforms. I presume you have studied the actual enlargement process, which comes after you have been granted candidate status as well. I myself have been in this town for a very long time, and I remember the arguments of some countries which after a few years said, this process lasts too long. If you don't let us in next year, we'll go back to communism. So there was a great deal of frustration in what are now the new member countries and then were the candidates. Do you have any estimate how long the actual enlargement process could take?
So I think that this is the question we should give the answer together with European Union. We understand all of the complexity of the issues and the geopolitical complexity of the issues, and those countries who are still waiting for the answers for a much longer period of time than Ukraine. But basically we see that the same as it has been happening after the Second World War. The war and the experience all of us gaining through this war now happening in one of the biggest countries of Europe is changing the rules itself. So I think the whole discourse, which has been started by issues related to enlargement of Ukraine, will boost the broader discourse of the enlargement policy, both for Western Balkans, for Turkey, and etc. While this discourse is ongoing, we will do our best that we take the opportunity for the integration into EU single market and other elements of being physically and economically part of the European Union. This is part of our strategy. We are going through that in a very dedicated manner in our cooperation with the Commission, but definitely what can Ukraine promise is that we will do our best to avoid any fatigue of enlargement from our side. And basically the history which has now been written on our soil, the history of the future of Europe, will definitely not allow us to be squeezed in the bureaucracy, squeezed into formalities, and hopefully after the war is over, we will redouble our efforts to boost this discourse and to give all the answers to the questions. We have now seen a lot of initiatives, for example, the one announced by Charles Michel or Macron about the broader political community I will be in Paris just in a couple of days, and we will be discussing in details this idea. I think this could be a first platform for political discussions where each country of different parts of the Europe will find its place in European Union, whether as a member of European Union or otherwise in any other format which we can agree further. But definitely Ukraine will not be a country which will be squeezed in promises. We will demand actions, but in due time and based on a consensus of all EU nations.
Thanks a lot. Maybe that's a good time to bring in Eva Meidel, who is now attending, if I am well informed, a conference of the EPP in Rotterdam. And perhaps one practical question is whether Ukrainian candidacy is also high on the agenda. But more importantly, coming back to at the very beginning of our session, what are the main concerns of citizens and of your electorate?
First of all, thank you very much for having me. I'm very happy to be joining you today, and I hope you can hear me relatively well. I'm indeed joining from the EPP Congress in Rotterdam, but I see around me everybody starting to dismantle the room where I'm sitting, so I hope they will keep the table that I found for another couple of minutes. I particularly want to also thank the Deputy Prime Minister for her very clear, very convincing messages. I believe the European Parliament has been the institution which always stood by Ukraine with its most powerful position and support possible out of all of the institutions, and will continue to do so, and I hope to continue the conversation with the Deputy Prime Minister tomorrow at Globsec as well. A brief remark from my side based on what the colleagues from ECFR and Bertelsmann have presented, as far as I was able to hear, because unfortunately connection for some reason hasn't been at its best today. What we see and the feeling we get as policymakers and people, you know, often being among the public, is that this crisis has increased the public trust in moderate political parties. In a way, the feeling is that right now is not the wave of populists and extremists. I see this in my own country and I see in other countries, but just the recent elections that have taken place in France and Portugal have also shown that. I think to a big extent, this of course was witnessed by the big unity, but to the big extent the Russian invasion also re-established in a way this idea of the democratic countries of the West. Until recently, many were doubting whether the West still exists. And the propaganda we were witnessing was saying that the West is weak and cannot stand against Putin. Well, we have seen that this is not the case, and this is not true. We are witnessing in an unprecedented amount of countries that the trust towards the European Union, but also especially NATO, is increasing. And of course, our Scandinavian friends have shown, this in a very concrete manner. My own country, Bulgaria, NATO ratings and approval are the highest for the past 10 years. I think a big part of society is realizing, it's remembering, being convinced why those memberships are meaningful, why they're important, and what do they mean for society as a whole. So the unprecedented war in Ukraine was a tipping point, especially when it comes to truly understanding the Russian underground influence in our society. Up until this moment, we were perhaps quite naive, but we knew that there is Russian state media dispersing propaganda. We knew that there were political parties that were on the Russia budget lines. We knew that they were misusing social networks, forming in a different way the public opinion, using dependencies and businesses. But it never instigated any concrete or hard measures. And I think this now has changed. And we have also seen in the public opinion, in my country, that where public opinion of Putin has always been quite high, unfortunately, thankfully, in the past months, his approval ratings lost 30% of approval, and disapproval has increased greatly. So in the same way of thought, speaking of political parties, I think people and citizens today expect some sort of leadership when it comes to what should be done in this situation. Both leadership, ideally inspirational leadership, and concrete leadership, able to take difficult decisions. In most European countries, we share similar, of course, attitudes towards the Russian aggression that we are witnessing in Ukraine, but there is a slight dependence depending on the reaction of the political leadership. I think people tend to support different level of engagement. Some nations are ready to participate in the war to support our Ukrainian friends in all ways and means possible. Others are more reserved. Especially when it comes to military assistance. And we know that this is one of the ways to win the war. And I am very unhappy that my own government has a very ambiguous position when it comes to providing military assistance to Ukraine. And this, despite that, I think the public opinion is very clear on the issue, the government has not managed to step in its effort and provide the necessarily military support that is needed and that it can provide. But last point, I think perhaps there is a significant risk because citizens have turned their attention and trust to moderate parties, but also their expectations. And what we see now, to hint a little bit on the economic parts of the situation, is that many governments around Europe are now using the so-called tool of helicopter money. We have been going from different crises, but we need to very carefully craft economic measures and economic policies. The so-called pro-market, pro-Western governments, including my own, they've already received the so-called note from the Commission that its budget deficit should not be sent into skyrocketing numbers. So we need now more than ever sensible policies which do support the most vulnerable, which do compensate for the high energy prices, but also are able to support the business, as without economic growth, it will be very difficult to compensate for the high prices. So my worry is that some governments across Europe will be tempted to use this helicopter money instrument, which could lead in the long run to a number of structural problems in the economy, and there are more experts today in the hall that can speak about that. And I think we need to be careful of that, not to use the current situation to create other long-term problems and issues for our economy. Thank you.
Many thanks, Eva, also for the last remarks, which of course I, as a, let's say, as a German fiscally hawk, very much share. But it comes back to the fundamental issue, which is, it's all good to say we need more decisions at the European level. Then the question is, and what policy should Europe pursue? So I wanted to take this occasion perhaps to ask Isabell only, just for a brief, say, analysis of, you said people are willing to give Europe more responsibility, but A, are they willing to make sacrifices for that? And B, how do they think actually Europe should use that responsibility? So in what direction should it go? Helicopter drop on the economic side or not? Of course, on the foreign policy side, hawkish on Russia or not? It's one thing to have, we think to say Europe should have a common policy, but which one then? Isabell.
Well, small questions make for very short answers. Wouldn't it be great to have a crystal ball in which we could kind of bring up all the questions to all our answers, you know, and then also knowing that they're backed by a majority of Europeans. Even though I do understand these very precise questions, I have to disappoint you. You know, there are no very precise answers in that regard. I can give you hints and appreciation. So one thing, and it was also mentioned by Tara, there is a tendency to have very high expectations towards the European Union and towards common European policy. So what we see time and again in these numbers that we produce several times a year is that when it comes to question of principle and potential, we get very high marks and constant high marks in support of common actions. So now when we turn around and we ask, so how does it actually go? And how do you think it will go in a short period of time? Then answers tend to flip and become much more negative. So when we started this at the tail end of the long tail end of the Euro crisis, this gap between expectation and reality check was very large, and it has narrowed over the past years. And this is good news, because I think on the one hand, you should expect, right, that there's a gap between, on the one hand, expectation, on the other hand, reality. But, you know, when it comes to political actions, I think policymakers, statesmen and women should be aware of the fact that this gap shouldn't be too wide, because it just tends to create frustration, and thus you get very easily in a great danger zone. So, but right now it tends to narrow, and that's good news. However, we get in a very particular situation right now, and I think there are a lot of very big issues on the table, and I think it just asks too much now to say, well, you know, now solve us the question of Ukraine enlargement, you know, because it came up. There is a support for enlargement, which is actually a very interesting figure, because for many, many years we saw people being very, very hesitant when we are asking about enlargement, and not a majority of them saying yes, EU needs to become or have more member states. However, this has now flipped, and we asked it in the last wave not only for Ukraine specifically, but also the general question. And both questions were answered positively, which is very good news for Ukraine. But it does not take away responsibility from policymakers to find out and negotiate what's the best way forward for Ukraine. You know, this answer lies not in this question, in these patterns. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Perhaps it's a good time to bring in René Ripasi, who is also a member of the European Parliament from a different party and from a different country than Eva, so maybe you have a different perspective also on helicopter drops.
Yeah, well, if you call yourself a fiscal hawk, then I might also be in that category, actually. But that's a different debate. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to indeed also come into this debate. I find it very interesting, in particular as it brings together expectation as measured by polling instruments, but at the same time requiring from politics to take bold action. And that was precisely what the Deputy Prime Minister of Ukraine gave us as a message. It's less time for rhetorics, more times for action. And whenever you act, you basically act in darkness, and you can hope that afterwards the public will support you in the decisions that you took. I believe the right mix is how we come forward. And therefore, I believe this session is very well placed as how it is called and what we are discussing here. And therefore, let's also make clear what is our starting point. Our starting point is, I believe, the candidate status for Ukraine. I totally share what the Deputy Prime Minister said here, that the European Union leaders have to take a bold decision on the candidate status, while knowing that the candidate status is more a symbolic thing than something that has legal consequences attached to it. But it is symbolic in a sense that we make a commitment. Ukraine is right in saying they were attacked by another country for the reason that they have decided to have a state form and a society that is living along the values that we cherish in Europe. And therefore it's only consequence to open our doors for this country as a matter of principle. Well knowing that actual membership requires additional steps, but that is acknowledged by everybody. But acknowledging this brings us then to the, let's say, dark side of politics, because it requires follow-up decisions, and that costs normally money. And when we give candidate status to Ukraine, that means we open the doors for membership. It means that we need to support and help Ukraine to get up to speed. It doesn't help any member state with a weaker national economy to enter the internal market, where there is no protection for any national market, and to compete from one day to another without any limitations with Germany, Italy, Spain, or France. They will only end up in worse situations than what we see in the Eastern European countries or in Cyprus or other countries like that, which brought us then to another economic crisis. So it is in their interest and in our interest to bring them up to speed, but that costs. That costs more than those little amounts that are currently discussed. So that means that we need to take money in our hands. And there are other moments where we have to take money in our hands. My colleague Maidel mentioned it. We have economic and social consequences, and there closes the link again to public expectations. We are now in a period where the weather is getting better. That means expenses that are needed to keep houses warm, etc., they are, let's call it at least, manageable. But once we are entering autumn and winter, and we will see that it's getting worse and worse and worse when it comes to energy prices, then I'm not so sure whether the decline in populism is a real decline, because I heard the other number, that there is a disillusion about the international system, around 70%, but even more, above 80% about the national system. And this is precisely the basis on which populism is feeding itself and is growing back again. So I'm not so sure that populism will not reappear once we are in the winter. That requires that we have to tackle the economic and social consequences of the war inside Europe. And that requires money. I'm sorry, whether it's not used in a helicopter manner or in a more targeted manner, in my eyes, it's more a technical thing. If you look at the overall amount that is necessary, for all member states are still suffering from the expenses of overcoming the pandemic. This is a lot of money that we are talking about, irrespective of how we may use it. So if you want to support Ukraine financially to get up to speed, to get into the European Union, if you want to create a proper redistribution at European Union level so that the most vulnerable are financially supported when it comes to the economic and social consequences of this crisis, then we are talking again about a lot of money that has to be spent, mobilized quickly. And then we have to return to old discussions about, do we need Next Generation 2.0? Do we need not a permanent crisis fund at the European Union level that is helping those countries that are massively still suffering in their public financial situation from the pandemic? Do we need here more, when we look at the fiscal rules, should we not just say this is a thing of 30 years ago? Let's just get rid of them and design something that is appropriate, so that if in 24 we return to the Stability and Growth Pact, we do not destroy everything what was now built up in order to avoid economic recession by the measures that we do. That requires basically the basis so that expectations do not decline even more and populists come back to raise, as we can see it in the polls. This is thin ice that we are still walking,
René, can I interrupt you? Eva has to leave us soon. If she has a 1 minute two-hander on what you are saying, then you can continue. Eva, anything you wanted to say? You agree?
Thank you very much. I didn't mean to interrupt, but I have to say the audio that I received, it's quite bad, so it's very difficult to hear the speakers apart from the Deputy Prime Minister, because she was directly connected on Zoom. I just think that, you know, in a sentence or so, I think, and it's nothing new to this crowd, I think we just need to be able right now to think more strategically than ever. The issues we are faced are so broad and so complex and so different that we cannot just look the short-term or the mid-term consequences. Whatever decisions we take, they will affect our societies in the long run. So in our small, relatively small jobs as policymakers, I think the decision and support we give to the other institutions have to have the long-term goal, and that is very difficult and very challenging. But if we do not do that, I think we'll find ourselves in a spiral of a number of other crises in the long run. And we should also use the momentum that we have today of that united West, of the power that we project, to use it in various arenas, forums, and topics. Many of you know that I'm very active in the technological sector, writing a number of their legislation and so on and so forth. That's going to be the next battlefield when it comes for world dominance. And so if we don't want to see the dependencies we see today from Russian gas, for example, if we do not want to see the same dependencies when it comes to the technological development, we need to not be naive today, and we need to learn from our mistakes. And find ways to ally those democratic allies and countries against the autocracies that are, you know, that we are witnessing what they can do and how they can put under severe threat our values. So that would be my message, and I'm very sorry I can't be with you and participate in a more meaningful way. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. René, I was very impolite in interrupting you, but now I think you have also another occasion perhaps recalling the fact that there are many other issues which still remain on the table and have become perhaps relatively also more important through this new, let's say, geopolitical challenge. Sorry, continue.
Yeah, no worries. I mean, that is all fine. That's how we have to manage in those times where we're still in hybrid settings. The main message that I wanted to give here is, if our objective is looking at the Ukrainian war to give a clear message to Ukraine that they should become an EU member state, that we also want to continue supporting Ukraine in this war, be it with military materials, be it with economic sanctions, then it means also internally we must make our societies ready and resilient, one of those Brussels words. But how we do this, if we give flesh to it, then it means also here bold action and overcoming certain positions that we were discussing over and over in the last 20 years. If we do not create more of solidarity when it comes to the sharing of energy resources that we are getting in. I mean, just the situation that Spain has the best infrastructure to get liquid gas into the energy system, having alternative resources for gas in Northern Africa, but they cannot share it with the rest of Europe because there are no interconnectors between Spain and France. These are the things that where I say, yeah, here Europe must act quickly and boldly to connect it, to create solidarity of energy sources, to create solidarity of financial means so that the most vulnerable can be supported, etc., etc. Only then the high support that currently there is for recently very unpopular subjects like enlargement, like giving the European Union more sovereignty of choices will quickly decline. So that means taking bold action in one thing has a lot of follow-up consequences that we must be aware and also name them and go for them.
Thanks a lot. Just one very small technical point. On the interconnectors, we at CEPS have been working for 10 years. And basically, conclusion of our people has been they would have made sense to establish a market and provide security for cases like this. But basically, the two monopolists on both sides didn't have any interest in having an interconnection. And the European framework was not strong enough to overcome that resistance. Sorry, but Tara, your results have been mentioned several times. I think there's this tension between this feeling, warm feeling of solidarity right now, Will it survive an economic and real winter?
Yes, I think so. I think the problem is that the two will be combined. I don't think that the feeling of solidarity will wane, but there will be a decoupling between this feeling of solidarity, almost philosophical solidarity, and the impact of the sanctions in people's lives. And what we've seen, and actually to reiterate your point as well, in the French presidential campaign, Marine Le Pen, the far-right candidate, already tried to instrumentalize this argument. She was already saying, I am the spokesperson for the French people, the true spokesperson for the French people. I'm the spokesperson for your living conditions and the rising prices that you are facing when it comes to oil, when it comes to gas, when it comes even to goods of first necessity, like food, are due to the sanctions the European Union is imposing on Russia. And so if you want to alleviate those sanctions and to improve your conditions of living, then you need to make sure that the EU doesn't vote those sanctions. So this was already part, in a way, of the European public debate. I think this will come back even more forcefully indeed when we get closer to the fall and the winter, and this is where it's problematic. Because how do you combine the solidarity, which again, I think will remain, and probably will remain even further if Russia continues to wage the war, if Russia continues to commit atrocities in Ukraine. But at the same time, there will be answers, and this is what's going to be very difficult for European governments and the European Union institutions, because there will be consequences. That's also true for citizens at the very micro level. And this is where populists may regain power. And one other element that I wanted to mention, because it was a way to reiterate Isabell's points, we've seen very strong support for action outside of the EU, for the EU to become a more geopolitical actor. But in a way, we've also seen numbers that want the EU to be ambitious at home. And so what we saw was that European citizens we interrogated also wanted the EU to protect, we said, their values, I would say, to protect the EU's principle. And so we asked citizens in the face of serious and sustained concerns about democracy and rule of law inside the EU in a member state, whether they would feel it would be legitimate for the EU to act. And our results were overwhelmingly in favor of the EU acting. And so we saw majorities across the EU supporting the Union criticizing said member state to the tune of 61%.
Even in those countries which will be criticized?
Even in those countries, and that was quite interesting. This is also where you see the gap between citizens and their governments sometimes. Withholding funds from said member state, 58%. And even restricting their voting rights inside the Council of the EU, that was over 51%. So we're seeing also a very strong ambition, but I think it makes sense for the EU to start at home in this process of being ambitious for itself and also in being consistent. It's hard for us, even talking about enlargement, to say that we have expectations for potential candidates or even granting candidate status to a number of countries who want to come in, and if we are not able to apply those principles to ourselves inside the Union. And this is where I guess that's another big challenge for the EU to face in the weeks and months to come.
Thank you. I allow myself one comment which I shouldn't on the substance, which I shouldn't make as moderator, but I cannot resist. My view is that our leaders are making a strategic mistake by giving the impression that high energy prices are mainly due to the sanctions. I think establishing this narrative, which can be established by populist parties, is dangerous, but also it is wrong. It is wrong in the sense that energy prices, if you look at the tables, the numbers already increased a lot before the war. The Commission, in its latest economic outlook, has a very nice table where it shows the increase of prices of many commodities, wheat, gas, palladium, whatever is here, right? Between the beginning of, I think, 2021 and now, and between February 24th and now. And in almost each case, you see a very large increase before the war and a smaller one following the war. And it actually makes sense because our sanctions regarding, let's say, the imports now have been decided about Russian oil, can only have a very small impact on the availability of crude oil on the world market. Because now we have the EU has decided on a ban on shipped oil, but once the oil is on a ship, the ship can just go somewhere else, right? So the supply of oil to the world market is not really diminished, and therefore it would be wrong to say we are paying, what is it, €2 plus at the pump because of our tough policy towards Putin. So, sorry, I made this plea because I think it is factually wrong and it is economically dangerous. Politically dangerous because it helps. Now, I wanted to perhaps return back to René. First of all, just to say whether you can confirm, let's say, for Germany also these impressions that Tara gave us. And the second point, which for me is very important, which I already asked that question to the Deputy Prime Minister, granting, let's say, candidate status, quote unquote, in an emergency manner, does it implicitly imply that the EU will be less demanding in applying the standard membership criteria?
Now, my understanding of the German situation, but I believe that Isabell would have even more to say on that, but I can confirm the findings if you look at the German situation. Although the German situation is still a bit particular when it comes to the military equipment situation. As a German, I basically only want to give, in that sense, context to this, that we should not forget where Germany is coming from. It's not that military, let's say, when Germany was active in the military senses, speaking of First and Second World War, it never ended well. And as a result, Germany became very pacifist in its understanding of the use of military and also military equipment. And the very fact that we had the Zeitenwende Rede by Olaf Scholz, the very fact that we want to reinvest into the army and that there is a discussion about the military deliveries is quite a jump for German public, but also for those who are taking responsibilities in Germany. And I think that should always be thought if we look at the German situation and the discussions that we have in there. But maybe at some moment of time we come back to the German matter. On the question with regard to the candidate status, I do not have the impression that it implicitly implies that we have a fast track for Ukraine to become a member of the European Union. Although, let's say, probably in the first emotional outburst, von der Leyen gave this impression. She was the only one who gave that kind of impression. Also within the European Parliament, the discussions are different ones, because the criteria that we have put in the treaties and that we have developed as Copenhagen criteria, they are not in order to be nasty. They are there because they are necessary conditions in order to become a working member of this European Union. It is not just a fitness club that we are. You must actually already be fit before you enter the club. Otherwise, you will have difficulties. And many of these, the very fact that the Central Eastern European countries were a little bit too early in there, ended up in a crisis that we had inside. And we have the situation of, conditionality in a sense that we can put on member states before they are becoming member states, but once you are in the club, it's getting very difficult. We do not have the tools for that. This is one of the homeworks when we look at the rule of law crisis, because we have treaty issues. So if we want to enlarge more, then we should not repeat the mistake of the Nizza Treaty, where we wanted to make the European Union being resilient when it comes to enlargement, but we've completely failed and we are suffering from that until today. So internally it requires constitutional reform in that regard, and hopefully the result of the Conference on the Future of Europe will be precisely that we start doing our constitutional homework. The second one is that we also have to see it in the broader context of other countries, and it was also already mentioned in the previous contributions, that having a candidate status for quite some time And we would basically create tensions if we are reluctant on certain criteria with regard to Ukraine, that we are not reluctant when we look at the situation in the Western Balkans, where it's going into wrong directions. So in that regard, I do not see any signs currently that there would be more relaxed criteria to be applied on the Ukraine's path towards the membership in the European Union. There would be probably one exception, I believe, and that is the amount of support that will be given by the European Union to Ukraine in order to become ready. That there's currently at least momentum that there's going to be more financial support and maybe even political support to bring Ukraine up to speed. But to relax the criteria, I do not have the impression that is the case.
Isabell, do you find that reflected in your own findings, that support for enlargement means we close one eye at least and let the country in because it has been so heroic in defending Europe? Or is there an awareness also that it might be a bit more difficult? And then I have a follow-up question, but we can come back later.
Yes, of course, of course. Well, you know, I believe just several things can be true at the same time. Just because people express a need to stand in solidarity in this situation of exceptional also shock and experience, and kind of we all need to recalibrate our worldview and our understanding on where we are, who we belong to, and also how secure we are in this situation. I think it is very natural to have also the need to express very strongly certain values and certain positions, which does not mean, as I tried to point out, that is also, and we were talking about prices, for example, and the effects on people's lives. So however the narratives, how these raising prices came about, they are in fact of life, and we see in the numbers that are obviously the number one worry right now in the personal lives when we ask people, so what do you think about, what do we worry about right now? It's raising prices. And how to cope.
Is there any indication that people connect the rising energy prices to politics?
No, what we can actually say is we had one question where we asked about energy independency, and we connected it with raising prices, and they said yes, you know, they are in favor of pushing towards energy independency from Russia, even though that would mean even more, even higher costs for energy. So now, look, I'm all in favor of taking these numbers very seriously. I'm not saying by this that when push comes to shove and we're in the next winter and prices are very high, you know, and rising even more, that is not an issue. And I think the high art of politics is just marrying the two, you know. And it's not going to be in the kind of data that I'm going to put forward what's basically the miracle solution and all that. This is why we have these wonderful professionals hackling these things out. I would like to say, if I may, two or three things about the German situation. Or maybe is that so exceptional, by the way, right? Because I mean, there was obviously a spotlight on Germany and the debate going on in Germany, as it tends to be for now and probably in the future as well. But as I also tried to point out in the beginning, I mean, these issues reach very, 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 very deep down into political culture. And we can see in numerous countries intense debates and shifts in general attitudes and what it actually means for political action. I mean, just to point out the obvious, Finland and Sweden, you know, made NATO membership. I believe Denmark is voting today on, you know, whether their attitudes towards the European defense policy has changed or not. I think a look towards Italy is very interesting. So on the one hand, you have Draghi, who has displaced a a position sans faille of support of Ukraine ever since. But when you look at what he's facing back home, there is no unity at all. And on the contrary to Germany, where the opposition towards the policy is mainly expressed out of parliament, in Italy it's expressed in parliament, and they're heading into general election at the beginning of next year. So, and this is my third point, and I mean, I don't know if we have a Q&A, but I really am interested in that. Like, where does this notion of the end of populism is coming from? I really don't get it. I mean, they are stronger than ever. They're in the middle of the system. They are pushing debates. They are actually driving debates. And I mean, we cannot, with every election that is going this way or that way, kind of reinitiate, kind of call it the end, the beginning, or the end of populism. No, I think these people are, they're amongst us. They're part of the system. They're not going away. Their positions are not going away. I think it's quite the contrary. They have managed to take a place so deep down in our thoughts that we are probably more influenced by them than they are by now influenced by us. So on that happy thought, what was the question again?
That is actually a very good start for a debate about my right and left here. But I wanted to take this occasion also to say that we also have a question and answer question session. So if anybody wishes to put a question, then please raise your hand. And I hope we have a walking microphone. We don't, so I will walk. Why don't you identify yourself?
Yes. Well, thank you so much for the wonderful debate and for the excellent moderation. My name is Nikita. I'm a young thinker at CEPS and a master's student at the LSE. And I had a question on the future of the European populism, actually. So during the second round of the French election campaign, presidential elections, Le Pen seeks support from the Michelin electorate rather than Zemmour's. So on that note, if the economic winter persists, should we expect European populism to shift its main ideological focus from migration and identity to economic issues and neighborhood policy? And what would that mean for the European political space? Thank you so much.
No, I think first we can ask René to answer to the pessimists. To
the pessimists or the realists?
The realists, you're quite right. Yes, you're quite right.
No, let's say I share Isabell's sentiment. Speaking of the end of populism, certainly since I have entered the European Parliament, which is rather recent, given that I only entered in February, and I see them very alive and kicking there in their worst colors. Speaking of my colleague Fest, for example, or others that are where you cannot see there is any decline, and I think this very much links indeed to the question that you have asked, because the point of populism is not that they have a political agenda. It very much depends on the zeitgeist in which they are active, and they will find their ways where they can put forward their simple theses that are exchangeable in terms of politics. It's just what is currently the fashion. And therefore, yes, they will go then into the direction of the energy policy or economic policy, which already was. I mean, the populist movement in Germany was built on the resistance against the euro, and it came up during the euro crisis, or the so-called euro crisis. As other populist movements in other countries, they grew up in the economic and financial crisis. So it's not that they are completely away from economic and financial policy subjects, although when they are saying something about it, it's hardly convincing, but they do. And so in that sense, they just shift focus. The main question is precisely the one that Isabell was raising, to which extent it is influencing the political agenda of other parties and other actors in the system. And here, the experience from the previous crisis is not very positive, since we took also hardcore stances in migration policy just because there were those voices, although rationally it was absolutely not necessary to do so. Yet, also Merkel, at least in the beginning of the migration crisis, stood up against it, and everybody's currently criticizing Scholz for the way of how he is governing. But precisely this way of governing is one that is rather insulating from attempts to define their own political agenda because there are just some people screaming. So this is really something that isn't working for him. That makes me then, again, positive, to end with a positive note in all this, that we still have leaders who can set up their own political agenda irrespective of the noise that is happening there. But I also see colleagues of mine that are adjusting their positions according to where the noise is coming from.
Isabell, reaction on your side, or you just feel vindicated?
No, I mean, also, I think it is. I guess my wish would be to be less traumatic in the optimism as in the pessimism, right? I mean, the system has been very up to dealing with this sort of debate, and we should be realistic about how it pulls us in the wrong directions, and it does have a lot of influence on how we debate issues and what kind of issues we actually debate and how far we venture in our thoughts and imagination when it comes to a future, because in the back of our heads there's also this little voice kind of going around saying, oh, what will these people say if we put forward this or that or something. So, but less trauma about the issue would probably help to focus on the target.
But
that's just my point.
Let me come back perhaps to what we discussed at the very beginning, namely that people are, let's say, more positive towards European approaches.
Yes.
Is that influenced by this, if you want, populist debate? Is it one which necessarily favors national solutions? Or could it just transfer, so to speak, to a European populism?
Oh no, I mean, I'm in that sense, I think I'm very optimistic, because I think, look, during the Euro crisis, there was this very stark pessimism hanging over everything, and nobody wants to hear about common European solution, et cetera, et cetera. And we kept seeing in our numbers that that's just plain wrong. It was like a general assumption, but it was just not covered up by the numbers. And then somebody like Macron came around and campaigned on a I almost want to say aggressively, positively European agenda, and everybody was like, whoa, how is this going to work? And we thought, well, that's pretty smart, and it actually did work. And then it also, not also that worked, but like his counterpart, Marine Le Pen, tried to just the opposite, and that did just not work. And I'm not going to go into the details because we venture out too far, but I think it's very important to point that out, is that and I think it's also coming back to your question. I think for populists, there's certain evergreens. So migration always is an evergreen, like it always will work for them. But they have a very hard time finding and occupying other issues that work for them as well. And they try them out, and they very quickly also leave them. So, and the European issue obviously is one. When it comes to the French campaign, I allow myself to say that I believe there's a certain pattern in the beginning of the campaign. You know, there is much to gain if you are very fierce against European common policy. The closer you get to the election date, the more careful you should be as a candidate, because if you overstep, you will, it won't do you any good in the end. Marine Le Pen did learn. She tried to hide that, but in a certain way, it is so a core of her brand. It's very hard to hide that fact away. But I also think that other populists in Europe did learn from that experience, and I'm again pointing towards the Italian election coming up. I think it'll be very interesting case to study how these things go there. To coming back to the numbers, Italy, very interesting case when it comes to the numbers. I really invite you to maybe go to the website youpinions.eu and check it out. We also, one more plug, have a Twitter handle @youpinions. So if you want to follow us for, fresh numbers every once in a while, please do. We'd be very happy.
Okay, that was the word from the sponsor. Just if I can take first another question here.
Thank you, Daniel. Jim Moran from CEPS. And in another life, I was an EU official. And one of the things I had to do years ago was to join then President Barroso on his delegation to the Bucharest summit of 2008. Now, I'm raising this because of what the Ukrainian Deputy Prime Minister had said in her, I think, rather passionate address, also a very sensible address, about broken promises. And I just wanted to read one sentence from the declaration that emerged from that summit in 2008, which some people may be aware of. It said, "We agreed today that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO. Will become NATO's members of NATO." It was done under pressure from then George W. Bush, the outgoing US president, who was a bit gung-ho about this, and European leaders basically fell in line. Now, of course, we all know the result. Nothing happened 14 years on, other than provocation of the Russians. It's part of a much wider story, but it's certainly part of it. And the reason why I'm raising this is simply to bring attention, based on what the Ukrainian Deputy Prime Minister had said, to the importance of getting it right. And as we go forward now into the European Council meeting, and I, for one, like many others, am very sympathetic to Ukrainian aspirations, but it will be extremely important to get it right this time, and not to repeat mistakes like that. I simply wanted to underline that, based on what she had said. Thanks, Daniel.
Thank you. That was more a statement than a question, but I think implicitly it raises for me, if you want, two issues. One is this will, this implicit promise, and we had already discussed that the promise for EU membership is always conditional upon lots of adjustments at home in the legal, economic, and social sphere, which can be only imperfectly gauged under the Lisbon criteria and remain always to some extent subjective. And the question there was, is there implicitly a discount? But for Tara, perhaps coming back to this foreign policy aspect, again, that for me two questions here. When people say, yes, more EU foreign and security policy, would they actually also be willing to will the means, right? It always sounds, yeah, we all do it together, right? To will the means, and I presume you heard that both from René and to some extent from Isabell. Would they actually then have the same policy, right? That might be, and then at the very end, I think this, everybody knows, is a question of security. Is it EU or NATO? Is it not NATO more than ever?
So to paraphrase Isabell, I think it can be both at the same time, or Macron, I don't know, it's my en même temps moment. Will the Europeans be okay to will the means? I think they've already done so. The European Peace Facility is now at a €2 billion contribution. That's a third of what had been planned 2 years ago in the European Defence Fund. So, and that's, of course, in addition to the military aid that's provided individually by member states to Ukraine.
But if I may say so, 2 billion, when Ukraine needs 5 billion a month, this doesn't sound to me as being...
Sure, but for now, Ukraine is neither a member of NATO nor a member of the EU. So the EU is doing this because it's the right thing to do, I believe, personally, but it wouldn't have to do anything. It's doing it already. It's not perfect. I wouldn't have believed it if you had told me 3.5 months ago that the EU would give 2 billion in aid through the European Peace Facility Fund to Ukraine. I wouldn't have believed it. So I think there's some acknowledgement here to be given. A lot more needs to be done. You're absolutely right. I think what we're seeing in terms of polling is that the support from the European populations to that is still very strong. There is a sense that the EU needs to take up responsibility, and it is an economic powerhouse. So if there is a moment to use this economic might for, I would say, a better use, maybe that's an overstatement, but for a really good reason, a good use, I think this is the moment. So there seems to be, not everyone will agree, but there's an overwhelming majority of people who do agree that the EU is going in the right direction. Would they have the same policy? Right now, they seem to be in agreement. What we've witnessed in the past 3 months is an amazing show of unity amongst Europeans and their transatlantic partner. I don't know how long this unity will last. I think we're already seeing breaches, quite severe breaches, and we should not be ashamed to name them because they are problematic. And unity for unity is not an end in itself, you know, it's just that we need to reach unity for a political goal, and I think the political goal of helping Ukraine as much as we can, as much as we could, was the one that we had stated. So we need to keep this unity for that purpose. Is it EU or NATO? European strategic sovereignty is about managing interdependencies, protecting the rules-based order, working with the transatlantic partner, but also understanding security in very broad terms. What the EU has done since February 24th, NATO could not have done it, and what NATO has been doing since February 24th, the EU could not have done it. The two need one another. But the reality of the matter is the EU cannot be just another one of the 39 strategic partners that NATO has. I think if we see at the end of the month Sweden and Finland joining NATO, then that will mean that out of the 13 NATO members, 23 are inside the EU. I mean, 21 already are, so that's quite a lot. But I think that makes an even stronger case to have a proper European pillar inside NATO, to have proper political coordination. And that might not be to the liking of all other NATO member states, but that's also what democracy and the debate of ideas is about. And I think what we've proven right now is that the European model is quite strong. It's not perfect, but it is quite strong, and we have a massive added value of being able to have these debates. The EU will not do collective defense, territorial defense anytime soon. It doesn't have the ambition to do so. So this will always be with NATO. But then that really calls for an increased level of political and strategic coordination between the two organizations. Andrew Duff, who's a former MEP, whom I think a lot of you know here, made this proposition in Politico, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago now. He was talking about a potential affiliate membership for Ukraine. But inside his article, he made a proposition which I found really interesting and which stayed with me, which is that he was saying now is really the time to look at and to implement the European Security Council idea we'd been mentioning since the UK decided to leave the EU. The Security Council could host third member states, the UK, Turkey, Russia, those member states, those states with whom we have a number of security issues to discuss. But it would also be the privileged platform for the EU and NATO to discuss this political coordination. And what the war in Ukraine has made clearer than ever is that this is needed. It has happened. On February 24th, Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, and Charles Michel, the President of the European Council, met. It seemed, well, natural to them that they needed to talk amongst the three of them because there were decisions that needed to be made. And all of the three of their institutions were needed. It's not that only one could find an answer, because the answer to the war in Ukraine is not just military, though it is definitely military. It's not just economic. It is political, and it is strategic. And I think the two are needed.
Thank you. That was the perfect European response. I see 2 questions over there.
Thanks so much, Tim Büter, Technical University of Munich. It's been suggested that EU membership might serve as something of a substitute for NATO membership for Ukraine, giving them an avenue for integration with the West without being quite as much in the face of Russia. that only makes sense for Ukraine if the EU is effectively providing the kind of security guarantee for Ukraine, which, strictly speaking, Russia, the United States, and the UK gave them in 1994, but which hasn't been worth a heck of a lot in recent months. Is the EU ready to do that?
I thought Tara said no.
I am not speaking for the EU, or the French government, I should say. I don't know if the EU is ready to say it. I don't think so. I think the whole point is that this needs to be discussed. We first need to decide whether Ukraine is going to join or have a candidacy status. I would start by that in the first place, I think.
Thank you. There was one final question over there. Okay, somehow the mic got lost on the way.
Yeah.
That's okay. We take you and then over there.
Is this on? Yeah, perfect. So I think as we've seen with the Ukrainian conflict, the importance of transatlantic cooperation, especially with NATO, and the idea that NATO and Europe will need to collaborate proactively in the future to ensure the stability of Ukraine. However, I guess I'm still thinking of the past administration and their reluctance towards NATO as well as European cooperation, and we have the midterms coming up in the US, and then in 2 years' time, the next presidential election. What does Europe do if another populist like Trump comes into power, a more isolationist person, which is, I think personally, a strong possibility in the future? Do we have to build up our strategic autonomy again, or how do we handle that? Because hopefully Ukraine will win the war quickly, but we don't know, it could be a protracted conflict, and even reconstruction takes so long. How can Europe go alone without the US in the possibility of an isolationist US?
Thanks. I think this should go to the politician on our panel here, who will have to deal with that eventuality.
Well, I could also now take the easy way out and saying the European Parliament has nothing to say when it comes to common foreign security policy, so we can adopt beautiful resolutions in which we say we need an embargo of everything and anything, and that tomorrow, and because nobody has to do it, also doesn't matter. But I'm not going to take this route because I do believe this is a more than relevant question. I mean, it's also basically linked to the previous question, and that's the law professor in me still talking, Article 42, paragraph 70 EU. We have a solidarity clause which is modeled after the NATO one in the EU treaties. There's a primary legal obligation to support an EU member state, including military means. And we have seen the first time it was used, 2015, by France, that the EU was not ready to comply with it. But it has to, because it's a treaty obligation, and therefore it is something the EU has to deal with, and something that now also Macron called for in Versailles again. So that means strategic autonomy. Yeah, for me this is still one of those concepts I don't understand, I must say. It's told everywhere, and everybody gives something else in terms of meaning to it. What is clear for me is that all those that think that a strategic autonomy means autarky, be it in security terms, be it in economic terms or others, they are totally wrong. That's not how this world works. Although globalization 1.0 is dead, that's something we should know at least now. If you look at what is happening in Shanghai, but also with the war, it's just not happening, it's just not working anymore. So we need to have a reply to that, and that is then strategic autonomy. It means that we have to speed up our own capacities also in military terms. And that is precisely what the German government with the Zeitenwende did, where Olaf Scholz created now an extra fund to improve the situation of the German army. The German army will be, after this investment program is finished, the biggest military force on the European continent, something that me personally I would find rather frightening than a positive thing, but it's going to be the case. And this is something that is also currently discussed when we are discussing Next Generation 2.0, where the investments into military capacity should be also financed by common debt. And this kind of things, and that is basically meant by it. If we discuss in 2 years again what does this concept of strategic autonomy mean, yeah, then we are a bit too late. But given the developments, in particular in Germany and in other countries, if we observe them, then we see we are already a couple of steps ahead in a way that we want to have the Americans as our partners, but we want to become ready to be able to act on our continent, even if America fails to to be a proper partner in that relationship.
Thanks. One last question over there.
Thank you very much. When it comes to the EU enlargement, there are some countries in the Western Balkans that have been candidate for membership since 2005, have harmonized 46% of the EU acquis into their national legislation, and still haven't opened the first cluster and chapters of the EU negotiations, mainly because of bilateral disputes with EU member countries that tangle the history of the Balkan countries instead of reforms for joining the EU. So do you think that there is a possibility to the EU to come up with a strategy to exclude the anonymity for bilateral disputes and use it only for merit-based issues when it comes to enlargement?
I'm afraid that's again for our politician. And you have 1 minute.
Yeah, I can give the same answer. But I believe you make a more than valid point, And I can basically refer a little bit to the words that Deputy Prime Minister from Ukraine said, that we have enlargement policy before the 24th of February and we have one thereafter. And we see movements also in that regard. Yet we heard again some of those bilateral governments again saying we will block or something like this, but there's going to be a different dynamic. So my hope, and honestly at this moment of time it's more the hope, but what I observe is that there is some foundation for this hope, is that there is going to be a movement also when it comes to these processes. Because you cannot move on with Ukraine if you do not solve those processes. They are entangled with each other.
Thanks a lot. That was excellent. We are at the end of our time. Let me now also have a word from our own house. We have published here very recently an analysis of what the EU has done in response to the Russians' war on Ukraine. And the title is a question mark, a transformational moment. I give you all 20 seconds to say yes or no, and maybe I start with Tara. Is it a transformational moment?
Yes. Can I stop here? I think so the past 3 months have been transformational, let's say that. It's going to be a transformational moment if we make a political decision out of what we want to do with Ukraine and Georgia and Moldova, whom we've not mentioned until now, but there is a trio now. And it is going to be a transformational moment if we decide what we want to do with these three and with the Western Balkans. And if we manage to transform the European project, because I think this is what this moment is about. And it's not just an institutional format question. I think the institutional format question comes in a second moment, and as Isabell said, there are really brilliant people looking at this. But if we do decide that we are taking the European construction a step further now, and that we are making all the political decision and granting it the political will, then it will have proven a transformational moment, and I think we'll know that pretty soon.
Okay, that was an if at the end. My question was not whether it should be, whether it will be. Isabell.
Yeah, might try. Yes, I also give it a firm yes. And I also add a little prediction is there will be transformation. It won't be perfect. And now what I feel is there is a big moment, there is a big shock, and there are big declarations and there are big expectations. And we're already trying to measure the reality from these expectations that were made basically 5 minutes after the shock happened. So what I'm saying is, and I think I'm on the safe side, yes, there will be transformation, yes, there will be change, no, it won't be perfect.
Thank you. What did Robert Musil say? Wir haben Traum verloren und Realität gewonnen. René.
I can also make it short. Yes, it's a transformational moment. I can only concur with what my previous speaker said to this. And but something that is not transformational is that we have to continue with the nitty-gritty of legislation. And I have in 10 minutes a shadow meeting on the reform of the General Product Safety Regulation, which makes it that I can also not give further explanations to why I think it's a transformational moment, just saying it's going to be one, although there's not much transformation in my work currently.
Okay, thank you very much. On this note, we close.